In 1682, an English farmer wrote down an odd piece of praise. He was describing a root. Boiled and served with butter, he called it the sweetest, whitest, and most pleasant of roots. The farmer was John Worlidge, and he wrote practical books for men who grew food for a living. The root was called skirret, and today almost nobody alive has eaten one. You will not find it in a supermarket in any country on earth. It is not rare, it is not fragile, and it is not hard to grow. It comes back every year on its own and shrugs off frost that flattens everything beside it. A plant like that does not simply disappear. So what took its job? Tonight we work out what actually took it. What skirret was, what job it did, why 2 languages named it after sugar, and why the potato, the usual suspect, has an alibi. The answer sits inside a shortage nobody thinks about anymore. This story does not start with the disappearance. It starts with the plant, because the plant explains everything that follows. Skirret is Siam cicerum, a member of the carrot family, and it looks like nothing in a modern vegetable aisle. Pull one up and you do not get a single tapering root. You get a cluster. 8, 10, sometimes 12 pale fingers radiating out from one crown, each about as thick as a pencil and about as long as your hand. Scrubbed clean, they are almost translucent, and they are sweet. Not sweet the way a carrot turns faintly sweet after an hour in the oven. Sweet raw, out of the ground, with the dirt still on them. William Turner recorded skirret growing in Britain in 1548, and it was old news even then. The plant had come into Europe from the East long before anyone in England was writing gardening books about it. That detail matters more than it sounds. When a plant appears in the written record already being farmed, without an introduction, without an explanation of what it is for, it means the writing caught up to a habit that was already generations old. By the time the herbalists got round to cataloguing it, skirret was simply a thing that lived in the corner of a kitchen garden, the way a rhubarb crown lives in a corner now. Nobody thought it was exotic. Nobody thought it needed defending. The way you harvest it tells you what kind of plant this is. In autumn, you lift the whole cluster, snap off the fingers you want to eat, and push the crown straight back into the hole. It regrows. Not from seed you had to buy, not from a bed you had to clear and dig over. From the same plant, in the same square foot of soil, year after year, for as long as anyone bothers to keep lifting it. And then there is the name. In Dutch, skirret is suikerwortel. In German, Zuckerwurzel. Both of those translate the same way, and the translation is not sweet root. It is sugar root. That is not a description of a flavour. That is a job title. None of this has to stay on a screen. If you want to keep and cook food the way they did, the medieval larder is at the Medieval Way store, bakery.medievalway.store. 12 preservation methods, 24 recipes. I will not mention it again. So, a root named after sugar. But the reason that name mattered is far bigger than one plant, and it starts with a shortage. Ask why a whole continent would name a vegetable after sugar, and the answer is uncomfortable. Because the continent did not have any. Think about what a medieval kitchen actually had to work with. For sweetness there was honey, and honey has a hard ceiling. It comes from bees. The bees work a few months a year, and a hive robbed too hard in autumn does not survive to work the next one. There is a second constraint on top of that one. The same hive produced beeswax, and beeswax was the hive's cash crop, because wax candles burned clean and bright while ordinary homes made do with tallow and rushlights that smoked and guttered. Churches and wealthy households bought that wax, and they paid for it. A cottage keeping bees was therefore sitting on 2 sellable products and eating one of them. Honey was never simply a food, it was a household's own income going into the pot. Cane sugar existed. It had existed in Europe for centuries by 1400, carried up through the Mediterranean and traded through Venice. But it did not arrive as a food. It arrived as a spice, sold by the ounce, priced alongside the pepper and the cinnamon, and kept in the same locked box as the medicines. Apothecaries dispensed it. Physicians wrote about its properties. A household that bought sugar bought it the way you would buy a drug, in tiny quantities, for a stated reason, and wrote the cost down. Meanwhile, the potato had not yet left South America, and would not for another century and a half. Now put yourself in that kitchen. You want sweetness, you have no money to speak of, and your two available suppliers are a colony of bees and a Venetian merchant. What do? You grow it. That is the entire logic of Skirret, and it is the thing that gets lost when the plant turns up on a list of quaint forgotten vegetables. Skirret was not competing with carrots for a place on the plate. It was competing with honey for a place in the budget. It occupied a slot that has no equivalent in a modern kitchen, because a modern kitchen fills that slot with a paper bag that costs about $2. Hold on to that word, job. It is the reason the usual explanation falls apart at the end of this video. Once you see Skirret as a job rather than a side dish, the historical record starts reading differently. Medieval and early modern cooks did not keep sweet and savoury in separate rooms the way we do. Sweetness went into meat sauces, into fish dishes, into combinations a modern palate finds genuinely strange on first contact. A sweet root in that kitchen was not a dessert ingredient, but a working one, closer to what an onion is now. Skirret went into pottages, where it sweetened the pot without anyone paying a merchant. It got boiled and buttered, which is the version Worlidge was praising. It got cut into lengths, dipped in batter, and fried into fritters, a dish that shows up again and again because the roots are already the right shape for it. And it went into tarts, where its own sugar did the work that an expensive spoonful of white powder would otherwise have had to do. The plant sits right across the serious garden literature too. John Gerard gave it an entry in 1597. John Parkinson gave it an entry in 1629. Neither man was cataloguing curiosities. Both were writing reference books for people who had to decide what to put in the ground, and Skirret earned its space in both. Nearly a century after Gerard, Worlidge is still recommending it in print, still calling it the sweetest root a man could set on a table. That is a plant holding its position in the professional literature for well over 130 years. You would think somebody would have noticed the moment it stopped being worth writing about. Nobody did. There is no year, no decree, no last recorded harvest, no argument in print about whether to keep growing it. It simply thins out of the books across the 18th century, quietly, the way a job posting disappears when the position has been cut. That is the shape of the mystery. A plant with no enemies, no disease, no legal problem, and no agricultural weakness, walking out of the record with nobody bothering to write the obituary. The version you have probably heard blames the potato, and the potato does eventually turn up in exactly the ground where Skirret used to sit, which makes it look guilty. But what actually did the damage arrived by sea, a long way from any garden, and it was not a vegetable at all. It was sugar. Not the sugar of the spice merchants, a completely different animal. Across the 17th century, European powers built plantation systems in the Caribbean, and sugar stopped being a luxury import and became an industrial commodity. Cane was grown, cut and crushed at a scale the old Mediterranean trade had never approached, and the effect on the European market was violent. Sugar came off the ships in volumes that broke the old price outright. Then it got processed at home. By around 1700, sugar refineries run by men known as sugar bakers had spread across Britain, from Plymouth to Glasgow, from Liverpool to Ipswich. Raw sugar arrived by ship and left the refinery as a hard white cone, a sugar loaf, wrapped and sold whole. A household bought the cone and broke pieces off it with iron nippers as it needed them, which is why so many 18th century kitchens have a small locked caddy in the inventory. The supply chain that used to end at an apothecary's locked box now ended at a grocer's counter, and then at a locked box of your own. Sit with the strangeness of that transition for a second. For a stretch of decades, the same substance was being written up by physicians as a medicine and broken off a cone by ordinary families to put in their tea. Sugar walked out of the pharmacy and into the pantry inside a single lifetime, and almost nothing else in the European diet has ever made that move. What it did to consumption is the number that explains this entire video. In England, around 1700, sugar consumption ran at roughly £4 a head per year. By 1800, it was somewhere close to 18. Estimates vary, and some historians put the 1800 figure considerably higher, but the direction is not in dispute. English sugar consumption multiplied around 5 times over in a single century, while across the Channel in France it barely moved at all. There is a cost inside that sentence that deserves saying plainly. The collapse in price was built on plantation slavery in the Caribbean, and the cheap sugar sitting in an English kitchen in 1750 was cheap because of it. That is part of the mechanism, not a footnote to it. Now go back to the garden. The whole reason to hand a bed to a fiddly perennial root was that sweetness was scarce and could not be bought. By 1750, that premise was simply gone. Sweetness was on a shelf, in a shop, in a form more concentrated and more convenient than any root, at a price a working household could reach. Nobody banned Skirret. Nobody bred it out, bought it out, or made it illegal. Its customers stopped needing it. The plant did not fail. The problem it solved got solved better by somebody else. That verdict only holds if the plant was worth keeping in the first place, so the honest thing is to admit that it had a real flaw. The flaw is the reason nobody fought for it, and it is the part the nostalgic version always skips. That cluster of a dozen thin roots is charming in a photograph and tedious in a kitchen. Every finger has to be scrubbed on its own. They tangle while you work, and soil packs hard into the crevices where the fingers meet the crown. Older plants develop a fibrous woody core running the length of each root, which has to be stripped out or eaten around. A decent bowl of skirret is 20 minutes of careful handwork before it ever goes near heat, and that was 20 minutes in a kitchen where the same hands also had bread to make. Against a potato, the yield is modest as well. Skirret gives you a handful of pencil-thick roots per crown. A potato plant gives you a pile, and nearly every ounce of it is dense starch. If what you need is calories per square foot of a small garden, the comparison is not close. And it was never close. When sweetness became something you could buy for pennies, the fiddly root lost the only argument it had left. It did not lose to a conspiracy, and it did not lose to a machine that could not harvest it. It lost on 20 minutes of scrubbing, the moment those 20 minutes stopped buying anything a coin could not. Which brings us back to the defendant and to the alibi. Line the two timelines up side by side because they do not overlap the way the accusation requires. The potato reached Europe from South America in the late 1500s, and then, for close to 200 years, remarkably little happened. It was grown in botanical gardens and treated as a curiosity. It was fed to livestock. It was regarded with real suspicion across much of Europe, partly because it belonged to a plant family that included things known to be poisonous, and partly because nothing in the existing diet told anybody what to do with it. Governments had to push it deliberately, with pamphlets and prizes and, in a few famous cases, outright theatre. The potato only became a genuine staple across much of Europe late in the 1700s, and in a number of places later than that. Skirret's thinning out of the garden literature is already well underway by then. The two curves do not cross where the story needs them to. By the time the potato was a serious crop in ordinary European gardens, Skirret had already been out of work for decades. Step back one more foot, because the deeper problem with the accusation is that these two plants were never applying for the same job. A potato is bulk starch. It is not sweet, it tastes of very little on its own, and it cannot do a single thing Skirret was grown to do. Asking a potato to replace a sugar root is like asking a sack of flour to replace a jar of honey. They share a shape and nothing else. What the potato genuinely did take was the ground. Garden space is finite, and once the potato was accepted, it delivered more calories per square foot than anything Europe had ever planted. Every bed it moved into was a bed something else moved out of, and by the time it came looking, the Skirret bed was the easiest one in the garden to surrender, because the plant sitting in it had stopped earning its keep. So the potato inherited the bed. Sugar had already taken the customer. And because the potato is the one standing in the empty room when the historians walk in, it collects the credit for a killing that was finished before it got there. That is the verdict, and it changes what you do with the plant if you want to grow one, because the reason to grow Skirret now is not the reason anyone grew it then. Getting hold of it is the first hurdle, and the trick is to ignore seed entirely. Skirret seed is slow, unreliable, and loses viability quickly, which is a large part of why the plant fell out of commercial catalogues even among growers who liked it. What you want is crowns, or offsets, split off an established plant, set into the ground in spring. After that you never buy it again, because every autumn's harvest hands you next year's planting stock for free. One purchase, then a permanent supply, which is exactly the arrangement that made it worth a bed in the first place. The single most useful piece of practical knowledge about Skirret is about timing, and almost nobody mentions it. Do not harvest before the frost. Cold weather triggers the plant to convert stored starch into sugar, the same mechanism that makes a parsnip worth eating after a hard night and worth very little before one. Skirret lifted in early autumn is a mildly sweet root. The same plant lifted after 2 or 3 real frosts is the thing Worlidge was writing about, and the gap between those two roots is large enough that anyone who tries the first one usually concludes the whole plant is overrated. The frost is not something the crop survives. The frost is what finishes it. In the kitchen, scrub rather than peel, because the sugar sits close to the skin. Boil the fingers until they give and eat them with butter, which is the oldest recommendation on record and still the best one. In an older root, run a thumbnail down the middle and lift the woody core out after cooking, when it slides free cleanly instead of fighting you. And treat it the way its own century treated it, as a sweet element inside a savoury dish rather than a plain vegetable on the side, because that is the context the flavour was built for. Follow the chain back, and the whole thing is one clean line of cause and effect, a continent with almost no sweetness in it, a root that could manufacture some in the corner of a garden, for free, indefinitely. Ships that made the same sweetness cheaper than the corner of the garden, a root with no remaining job and 20 minutes of scrubbing still attached to it. And finally a new crop walking into the bed that had just come free, picking up the blame on its way in. Worlidge was not being sentimental in 1682. He was describing, accurately, the best sweetener a man of his income could produce with his own hands. Within his grandchildren's lifetime that sentence had stopped being true, and nothing whatsoever had changed about the plant. We dig up the knowledge history buried. Which surprised you more, the sugar root's name or the potato's alibi? Subscribe and keep digging. Until next time.